Greer's here?
Yeah, I sent an email to Wes, and Wes, are you here? Wes.
He's there. I mean, I see him.
Okay, there's Wes. Yeah. Everyone, I don't know if you've used Zoom before. I've barely used Zoom, but your microphone is muted. I decided to exert my tyrannical authority on you all and mute you as you enter the room. That way I had the floor de facto. So if you decide to speak, you owe me $1. No, actually, you have to unmute your mic, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, I believe, if you want to speak. And feel free to speak at any time. I'll let more people in. Okay, so I don't have any. There is zero plan for what's about to happen, and there was actually zero plan for what was happening. But that's okay. So I'm here in Dr. Shinkevich's basement, and it looks like we are, as he put it once, in the basement of Hannibal Lecter. But this will hopefully be this is where we've been recording most of our stuff. Okay, so we'll just jump right into things since some of you woke up very early for this. We finished Clarke. I know I was Dr. Shinkevich and I were ahead of schedule when it came to recording things. So you are probably maybe not quite to the end of the recordings, the podcasts, but they're all up, I believe. Yeah. Does anyone have any difficulty finding those? Hopefully not. I need to figure out, hold on, I'm trying to, how do you get it so that it changes? There you go. No. Hold on. Okay. Well, I'll just say this. Does anyone have any questions while I try to figure out how to do this technology thing? Any questions, thoughts, stuff that you liked in the text that we didn't talk about, stuff that you didn't like in the text that we either did or didn't talk about? Anything? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, if we want to jump into it, I've got a bit of a question.
Yeah, Dan, yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of getting into it, but I'd love if you two could go over the distinction between the one of Plotinus and how we talk about God with that, and then the being as relation and how we can distinguish how being as relation helps us not be pantheists, and then maybe like, what do we mean when we call God one, not in a pantheistic way? Just like clarifying that distinction would be helpful.
Yeah. So kind of the thread of pantheism and how being as relation sort of overcomes the threat of pantheism. That's kind of the question. Yeah. Yep. So the worry that I've always had, I mean, for myself, the worry that so when you really start to understand what it means to say that God is being itself, and you understand that all being that exists that's not God depends on God, and you really take that seriously, then you run the risk of making everything like a feature of God or an accident of God, or kind of you run the risk of doing what Spinoza does, and I'm not sure if most of you probably aren't very familiar with Spinoza, but Spinoza was actually a Jew who was a famous philosopher, mathematician, just all around smart guy, kind of in the Enlightenment time. And he thought that that God was being itself, and therefore everything that exists has to depend on God, and therefore it can't be a substance, because to be a substance is to exist through yourself, from yourself. It's to have your own, like have your own existence. And the problem when you take God to be being itself is that all other it will just say this: anything else would actually not really, in the true sense of really, be. It would just be ultimately kind of a Spinoza put it as an accident of God, or a mode of God, or a feature of God. And so really all that exists would be God. Everything else is sort of pseudo fake existence, or I mean, not really fake, but it's just quasi existence, accidental existence. And so that's actually when you take God to be a first cause or primary being, and you're not worried about that, then you probably don't really understand what it means for God to be pure existence itself. It's something that's really a troubling worry for theists, to say, how can anything other than God exist? That's the real danger. I don't know if you remember in Schmitt's from, was it last year? Was it already? That was last year. So there's this great philosopher, Kenneth Schmitt, said the problem isn't arguing that God exists. The real problem is arguing that anything other than God exists. That's like the real difficulty. And I think what Clarke is doing in Person and Being is he's allowing for a metaphysics that helps you to avoid that danger of conflating all being into simply God. Because what you have is, there really is nothing which is just pure isolated substance itself, or pure isolated being itself, because to be always requires something like a dependency. But what Clarke doesn't put it in terms of dependency, he puts it in terms of receptivity, active receptivity. So to be an individual, and a perfect individual, to be perfect being, would be to be responsive to, not necessarily in an accidental way, but in some sense, to be responsive or receptive of another. And so it's already built into the structure of being, even if you don't want to think of being as like structured. But what's built into what being is that it's dialogical, or it already has room for, and not just accidentally, but it's sort of being itself, that there is communication, because Clarke's saying that's just what being is. And so there seems to be the possibility for a difference to occur between the giver and the receiver, and for them both to be in virtue of their difference. Whereas like a monist or a pantheist, or someone like Spinoza we're talking about, anything other than just being itself is non-being. Whereas what Clarke seems to be suggesting is to be would actually require two sides of the well, three sides really, but at least two sides of.
I don't know if you can say. I think you'd have to say at least three. But.
Yeah, feel free to. I don't know. Can you hear Dr. Shugevich is talking in the background? I don't know if anyone can hear him. But yeah. So I think the mere dialogical, this is going to sound really bad. If Clarke was still alive, he would not like this. But the mere nature of being itself is non-monistic, and therefore there's room to say to be perfect being requires that there are others that are different from you, and that it doesn't exclude them from being either. So it's kind of this quasi-paradoxical thing. To be one is to be many.
Yeah.
And therefore monism is just as incoherent as perfectly isolated multitudes, like Leibnizian. I'm not sure if any of these philosophers, maybe for those that have taken early modern philosophy, you have these two extremes. There's only one thing, and then there's just a bunch of isolated things. And I think both of those are excluded in light of Clarke's metaphysics, because you can't have a many without there being a one, and you can't have a one without there being a many. These are mutually fulfilled in each other. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, can I add to that? I'm gonna be weird. Hold on.
Wait a second.
Audio problem.
We sound like Metallica.
You turn off your audio for a second, Jager. I'll turn on mine. See if that works. Okay, yeah, that works. So if you guys can still hear me, hopefully. So I think Jager, you're getting at this, and this is one of the reasons why I think Clarke is so amazing, because and I don't know if we mentioned this in our podcast or if we were just talking about this outside off mic, right? But the fact that I think Clarke is a true philosopher, right? The true philosopher is the one who takes into account all of truth, right? All of being, all of reality in some real sense. You have to take everything seriously. If you don't take everything seriously, then you're not a true philosopher. I mean, I think a scientist would agree similarly with this kind of an understanding, right? If you don't take everything into account, then you're not really trying to find out what's real. And so he doesn't sort of section off Trinitarian revelation as something that I don't think about because I'm a philosopher, but theologians have to think about. As if you can do philosophy, being a Christian, actually thinking that Christ revealed the heart of being, and get to the heart of being, ignoring that, right? Yeah. And he just refuses to do that. And I think the reason that he refuses to do that, or I think that the reason that he has this distinction, I keep looking at page 87 here, where he talks about 86 and 87, where he basically says Balthasar is the man, and then he says you have to take seriously the Trinity, which has persons in it that are subsistent receptivity, and we talked about this last time, and I kind of argued against him saying the Son was, and instead saying the Spirit is. But I think that the bottom of that paragraph, that where he puts that, and maybe this is what you were thinking about, Dan, when you asked your question, but that the highest instance of being is unity that is not solitary, like Plotinus is one, but communion. And this is revealed as just what, instead of maybe the structure of being, we can talk about Schmitz's language of the texture of being, right? The texture of being just is a communion, which enables us to, I think, save ourselves from monism. Yeah. And therefore I can be myself and be perfectly united with being without losing myself, without losing my in itselfness, as Clarke would put it, because in itselfness becomes mostly in itselfness when it's in communion with the other. But this is all I think this is all coming from Trinitarian reality.
Yeah, and I think if you don't have this,
you're on mic.
Am I?
You're good now.
I'm on. Okay. So I think if you can people hear me? Okay. I have no idea what I'm doing. Okay. But I think if you don't have what Dr. Sienkiewicz just quoted in Clarke, if you don't have unity which is not solitary but communal, if you don't have the possibility of a unity which is communal, then you would have to say that the Son is the first creature, I think. I don't think you would be able to have
The Judaistic.
you wouldn't be able to have an equal to God, which in some ways was begotten by God, flowed from God,
Right.
however you want to put it. You wouldn't be able to have that. And so I think it's not simply, oh, this is an interesting example of how you have a unity in community or union within a communion. But I think what you see is that is precisely what the Trinity and therefore being itself consists in. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to say either the Son is just no different from the Father, but just what's the modalism? Is that the heresy, the Trinitarian heresy? I forget.
Yep.
Either you're going to say that the persons are just all really one, and there's really no difference. It's just difference in sort of their operations or their acts or however you want to.
The one dude.
The one dude acting in all these different ways, or you're going to have to say that the Father's really God and everything else is not really God. It doesn't actually constitute a real unity.
But here, let's see if we can get over.
But I think that the problem that you're gonna the weird paradoxical problem that results in all of this is that if you deny the communality of being, and therefore the Son has to be the first creature. But as we were just started this question with, really even creatures stop existing, right? So not if you say the Son is the first creature, really you're just saying the Son is the first accident of God. Like we're the accidents of God. We're the modes of being.
It folds into an even more global modalism.
Yeah.
It becomes a much more sort of expansive.
It's a universal modalism, which is just what monism is. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, pantheism. There you go. Yeah. Rock and roll.
I don't know if we have any sound on it.
Okay.
All right. I've got a question.
Yeah. I like your bookshelf.
Thank you. Come on. So question regarding so I know in the podcast we talked about, again, do dogs love?
Yeah.
So, I know that in Clarke, he mentions that St. Thomas does admit that animals, especially the higher ones, do possess a certain spontaneity of choice that is limited participation in the higher self-conscious freedom that characterizes human persons. And so it seems like he's saying that, they have a lower level of choice, which means that maybe they can have a lower level of love than humans. But it just doesn't seem like that's possible because, love is willing the good of the other. So I don't know how you can even consider it love because they can't actually will at all.
Yeah.
So that's my question.
Yeah. Any thought? I mean, I'm happy making this a discussion. I don't know if that's possible in light of it maybe being 6 a.m. for some of you. But so if anyone wants to jump in and contribute any thoughts to that, I have a few thoughts. The next book we're going to read, you have it, the Schindler book, Love in the Postmodern Predicament. I think it will get into that issue a little bit. So I have a few thoughts, but I want if anyone wants to contribute anything.
I stand by my belief that dogs can love.
I knew you would.
What's your reason?
Well, loving would be I am willing the good of the other. And Clarke was saying animals don't even have that self-knowledge or self-possession of the ability to say I in any real sense.
Yeah.
I think that love is said in many ways. So I think you do need to be clear if we're talking about like because I mean I don't think if I were to I don't know like beat a dog every single day, no matter what dog I had, I think that dog would end up hating me. Whereas humans can make the incredible choice to ignore like negative reinforcement and continue to love. Case in point, like like the Mother Teresa's, John Paul II's, and people like that who Gandhi's.
Nick, we're still friends. That's the case in point there.
Exactly. Yeah. The fact that I'm still friends with Dr. Jager, even though he gives me bad grades, and but the fact that those dogs, that it doesn't seem as if dogs have that kind of ability to push apart like reinforcement and like their reaction.
Right.
Seems that it definitely like even though they can show affection, they wouldn't do that if we didn't scratch their ears and give them belly rubs.
Yeah, and I think I'd be willing to call it affection. I think I see what you're saying, so I think I'd be willing to call that affection, not love, but I think you have to draw that distinction there. But it's just how I'm looking at it.
So,
Zach, you should look a dog in the eyes and tell it that it doesn't love you.
I don't think it would understand me. So.
Oh, that's so sad.
I think part of it would have to come to be like when we choose to love, like that's our desired end for a person in a sense. And I don't know if a dog can have that desired end to like, I guess you could say a dog could sacrifice itself for another, but in terms of like what I'm thinking of love, like if you're kind of like down in the dumps and a dog like sticks like nose under your hand or something, is it pursuing the greater good for you, or is it just like pursuing affection for itself, I guess? Like what are the ends it's trying to achieve, and if it can show love, is that the ends that it's meaning for you?
And I mean, in C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, he classifies affection as like one as a love, and so I think again it would just depend on if we're talking about the. Thanks, Will. Yeah, you'd have to like say what exactly you're classifying love as if it is that kind of like self-sacrificial, a love for another person. I don't think a dog could show that unless it's been trained to do that. But yeah, that it might be, honestly, it might be a question for like a veterinarian or someone who works with a lot of dogs. It would be an interesting one to see like how much, how much they can like kind of choose despite like reinforcement.
So here's a thought. Can people hear me? Okay. Sorry, I don't know why I partly because I think I always mess things up on electronics, that this isn't working, but okay. So somewhere here in Clarke's, I think it was one of the last sections. He talks about being, and he says being. You can think about being in a multitude of ways, and ultimately he thinks that person is not something that's added on to being. So that to be a person isn't that you're a being and then you add some sort of special person like juice or person form or something. He basically thinks that being has sort of it has the characteristics of personhood. Now that doesn't mean all beings are persons. It just means that all being has the in a much more imperfect sense what persons have in a perfect way, which is what allows us to call persons distinct from all other beings, but yet still to say all beings have a an ordering to perfection, which ultimately in the physical world, it's going to be the embodied person. So he says, I wish I could.
I think the top of 71 kind of talks about that in view of like what Thomas thinks.
Yeah.
Do you want me to just go ahead and read it?
Yeah.
But person for St. Thomas, as we have seen, is the highest, most intense expression of the perfection of being. There are, of course, varying levels of perfection within the order of personal being. Once we have crossed the threshold dividing it from subpersonal, we know of three infinite perfections: God, finite pure spirits, angels, and human beings as embodied spirits.
Right. Yeah. And so in light of that, I think towards the end, and there's somewhere else he says this a little clearer, but it's definitely towards the end. Right on page 112, it's one of the last pages. He says, so recapping the whole work, in light of all this, to be a person is to be with, to be a sharer, a receiver, a lover. And somewhere a little bit earlier on, he talks about to be ultimately then is understood as love. So the way he gives ultimately his characterization of being as self-communicative, receptive, and communal, he says that's just what love is. And so I think given that you can have different degrees of being, different degrees of existing, and therefore different ways in which being can manifest itself, or the way being can limit itself, you can have therefore love limiting itself in a various multitude of ways. Some of those ways are going to be such that it's a more perfect expression of being, and therefore a more perfect expression of love, because it's going to be more capable of being self-communicative, more capable of being receptive, and therefore more capable of being communal. But I think he wants to say, you don't want to say, oh, here are the beings that are self-expressive, receptive, and communal, and they're called persons, and all these other ones, and therefore they can love, and all these other ones can't love because they're not receptive, self-communicative, or communal. He says, no, all being is that. Therefore, all being in some ways is an expression of love, and therefore it's capable of entering into some form of communion, some form of, I don't want to say interpersonal, because they're not always persons, but inter-quasi-person or inter-being relations, such that they do bring about a type of love. This is why any sort of relation that you have with something is going to, he thinks, if it's going to be a meaningful, fulfilled type of relation, it's going to have those three aspects. And you could think of this at different levels, thinking about the relation you have with your pets, the relationship you have with your state, with your community, with your family. If it's not self-communicative, receptive, and communal, then he thinks it's going to actually be like only a fake being, or not a real sense of being. So the degree to which a reality is communicative and receptive and communal is the degree to which it's real. And so this is, I think, what constitutes the reality of marriage, and the reality of friendship, and the reality of governments. The more communicative and receptive and communal they are, the more real they are. And so I think you can talk about to be is to love, and therefore, of course, dogs love, but that doesn't mean love is, as Nick said, always the same in all senses. Just as being isn't the same in all senses. If you said a cat exists, a tree exists, oh, therefore a cat is a tree, that's a really bad sort of logical fallacy. I think you'd have to think about not all things exist the same way. Not all things are therefore lovers in the sort of, I mean, this is a quasi hippie way of putting it, but in the same way, right? So I don't know, that was just a thought that I had in light of, because I knew this was going to come up. Someone was going to ask about whether we can love our pets. And when I was reading this, I was thinking about that in light of our earlier conversation in the semester. But,
Well, thank you. I hadn't thought about it that way. So,
any other thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing from.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
our brothers Karamazov.
yeah, exactly.
That's actually a podcast, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, the passage, where he's talking about his brother asking the birds to forgive him. I think in the same sense, you could ask your dog to forgive you if you have been punching it a lot lately,
Yeah.
But he
I
says,
guess I should probably go through that.
yeah, he says, let's see, it may be senseless to beg forgiveness of the birds, but birds would be happier at your side, a little happier anyway, and children and all animals, if you yourself were nobler than you are now. It's all like an ocean. And he then goes on later to talk about everything kind of flowing and receiving and
Yep.
moving inward and outward.
And even in that same chapter, he talks about why do you think you're better than the birds, or why do you think you're better than the dogs? They haven't sinned. You're the one that has done far worse in regards to what they, even though in some sense you have the capacity to do more, you haven't done that. And so who's really better off as a lover? The flowers that, all they do is good, or you capable of doing, infinite good, but yet seemingly doing mostly infinite evil. Right? So who's really doing the better act here? And that's something Dostoevsky is really, really worried about. Yeah. We don't have to make this all about Dostoevsky. Yeah, good point.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so when he talks about the I-thou relationship, I don't know, I'm looking at page 45 and then page 66, where he talks about how, like, you need another to wake up your I, like, to be seen as a thou before you can, like, come to know yourself as an I. So I was just thinking about, like, we talk a lot about how technocratic paradigm and everything, like, we come to see people not as people, but as, like, I don't know, just like things for us to like consume or use or whatever. So like, how does that affect this? Does it affect that? I don't know. That was kind of my question as I was working through this. Like, what does this look like for us now? Like, I know he wrote it semi-recently, but yeah.
93, I think. Is that when this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here, let me put my audio
Here we go. Hold on. I'm going to pass the mic.
Okay. Oh, now you got to turn your audio off. Okay. Yeah, I mean, Lexi, this is what we've been talking about in our seminar, obviously, right? But I think that I think this is a key point, because if there's a metaphysical background to the whole thing, where the only way that I can understand myself is through the other, and we might even say, as Clarke puts it in a number of ways, it's not just the mother. It's this web of connectivity that is sort of the milieu within which I become what I am, and also in some sense constitutional of me. Then it seems to me that if I can only know myself from the thou, or from the plural thou. Is there a plural thou? I don't know. Maybe. Ye.
Y'all.
The ye. Right. Yes. Y-E. Right. If it's from all those others around me that I get to know me, or that I understand myself, then if there is some sort of a messed up way that I see them, or they see me, right? Both, I think. Then there is going to be a very foggy and misguided self-discovery, I think. you're going to think of yourself in a way that doesn't correspond to yourself. And I'm not going to say therefore, because I think these are going on hand in hand. You're going to think of others as they aren't, and ultimately you're going to think of God as he isn't, right? There's this great line from Aquinas, which I don't think is brought up here, but I've read it, and I think it's Pieper, who says, when Thomas says, to have a misunderstanding of creation is to have a misunderstanding of the Creator. And so there seems to be this, maybe, let's say, just as there's a web of connectivity in being, especially if knowledge and being are as united as sort of the Platonic thinkers claim, right, that you become what you know, then there's definitely going to be also a web of connectivity of knowledge. So to misunderstand one thing is to misunderstand all other things because of the connectivity of everything, and including and most dreadfully two other things, yourself, which maybe isn't an other thing, and God, right? And those two things are going to be misunderstood because of my misunderstanding of all of reality, of all of creation, having to do with, stuff like the technological paradigm, but it's not just the technological paradigm. And I mean, that's its flavor for us today, but it's always going to be a fallenness, which is by its nature a separation of beings from each other, right? And a separation of beings from each other is a disintegration of being, right? It's a movement towards non-being. All right, I think you have to turn on your audio.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's a really good question, and it's hard to know whether or not you are correctly understanding yourself and therefore understanding the world, because in some ways, as what Clarke says, you understand yourself through understanding others. And it's also the case that it sort of then folds back, and so you understand others by understanding yourself. This goes back to the ancient Delphic oracle, know thyself. And I think if you aren't at all even interested in the first place to have an authentic, genuine self-knowledge, then there's little hope. I mean, there still might be some hope, but the first step is that you have to recognize, maybe I'm actually somewhat deceived about who I am, what I am, and also therefore what the world is. And this is, I think, the great Catholic tradition of examining your conscience every night, I think is I mean, in some ways, yeah, the sins that you've done, and for many of us, that's, you don't need more than like 10 seconds to like figure out what those were that day. It's really easy. But I think upon a much deeper level, I think you can recognize and ask yourself the questions: why did I really say that? Now, it wasn't like I said something mean, but I said something good. Why did I say something good? Was it because I wanted to, think that I was a good person? Or was it because I actually was concerned with the other individual? And I think that sort of deep analysis of one's own actions, you see, ties you up with how you relate to the world. Do I do this because of the other and for their sake? Or am I concerned with the other's sake for my sake, right? Which one's primary? And I think just not even asking that question is probably the biggest concern. If you're asking the question, you're thinking, I don't know how I'm going to come to an authentic understanding of myself, but I ask myself this question every night, then I think you can rest assured that there's great hope that you are getting very close to a good, authentic understanding of yourself. Partly because, and this is just sort of waxing and waning in light of, this is I feel like I'm on like the Home Shopping Channel. Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, who says that it's hard to understand what man is partly because man is this infinite journey towards the infinite good, which is continual progress. So to understand man requires an understanding of his end, of his telos, and turns out that his end is infinite. And so if you're constantly searching for what you are, who you are, and you're not fully satisfied, I think that's just an indication that you're like doing the right thing. You're on the right path to understanding man because of that very fact of how mysterious you are. And you I think when you do that, you see just how mysterious reason and will are, because of this fact that you can ask this question that pushes you into the infinite. So I don't know if you want to fully conceive of the task of coming to a completed understanding of man as like the goal. The goal maybe isn't to complete one's understanding of what man is, but rather to realize that the proper understanding of man might actually be this thing that opens up and you see sort of it's almost like, what is the proper understanding of like your friend or your spouse or your child? And you say, okay, I'm getting closer, but what is it? What is it? And I think to think that it could be like limited is maybe to objectify that individual, such that that individual is now no longer this sort of infinite depth. And that's, I think, what's distinctive. Maybe that's all being, but that's at least distinctive about persons. Yeah, that was just a thought.
So
there you go.
To push back against that a little bit, my question.
You're gonna do what?
Gonna beat my dog. No, to push back against that, my question is, so in the Aristotelian and I suppose by extension Thomistic kind of understanding of metaphysics as I understand it, which, you know, feel free to correct me, but that the goal is to kind of have a understanding that in the metaphysics, Aristotle says, you know, if we don't have an understanding of being, we don't have an understanding of anything, because if you don't have this understanding of the central thing of what we talk about, then everything you're talking about is just kind of like an unmoored, just gibberish that has no base, and therefore no true, basically everything becomes relative. Everything is just an absolute relativity. There's no actual like ground for anything to stand on. So if Aristotle then says, you know, then I'm going to try and find the absolute ground, which he comes to kind of his understanding of like the absolute least most, you know, the species, the form which we all share, the form of either human or whatever subspecies, you know, that he says this is the grounds for being. And it seems that Thomas Aquinas kind of takes this on, and our entire understanding of kind of Thomistic Christology also seems to have to like take this into account, that Christ took on this form that we all share. So if you can't have kind of an understanding of persons or of being, then how are we all not just essentially nihilists?
Any takers? Okay, so I think it's also important to keep in mind for Aristotle and for Thomas, and I mean this is getting very this is pushing us beyond the sort of the scope of philosophical psychology. Hopefully you can follow. So if you can't, that's okay, because we're now like kind of moving into metaphysics proper, but I have faith. So I think you need to also keep in mind Aristotle's very famous dictum that being is said in many ways, and he's kind of looking for what's the central meaning of being, and it seems to be in some ways substance. And I think one thing that you can say is to talk about the central meaning of being, like what is real being? What is it to really be? I think what you can say is maybe what it is to really be is to properly be at whatever, and if you want to call it level or whatever domain of existence it is. So one way to think of it is accidents. People think, oh, they're like quasi beings because they depend on substances. But I think you can say, no, they're not quasi beings at all, because an accident, to be an accident, is to be a modification of a substance, or it's to be a way of existing of something. And so it's not a quasi being. It's only a quasi being in relation to substance, but as what it is, it's fully real. And I think what you can say is to be a person is to be ultimately what persons are. And I think in light of what we were saying earlier, persons are not these things that are they sort of they open up their realities and entities that open up into the infinite in virtue of their intellect and their will. So that's sort of in virtue of being a person, it seems to be, it's this expanse into the infinite that all other beings are sort of mirrors of, but they don't have the full capacities to actually move towards the infinite as infinite. And so I think you can say, here's, just as the Catholic theological tradition says, here's the best name for God is the unnameable, right? Here's the best way to understand God is that you can't understand him. And I think to say, here's what it is to be a person, it's to be, and then you fill in that somewhat paradoxical thing we were saying, it's to be this reality, which is, a mysterious one. And that's because, and Clarke kind of gets into this a little bit, but that's because persons are distinctively in the image of God, that if you are to properly understand what a person is, would be to recognize it as like the most perfect image of God, and therefore it's this image of a mystery. And so to know what a person is properly requires to say, I know it as something which I can't fully know. And that's because it's imaging God. Does that make sense? I mean, we tend to want to, I don't know, it's kind of spiraling, but we tend to want to think to define something requires being able to limit it. But when it comes to things, well, in general, the definitions or the understandings of things are going to have to be respective of the subject matter in question. So the mode by which you come to understand an object is going to have to be determined by the object in question, not by you. Otherwise, you become this sort of Kantian approach to epistemology, that my mode of understanding is going to be what sort of determines what can be understood and what is understood, where I think an alternative would be to say, no, the objects determine the mode by which you come to understand it. And for mysteries, the way you come to understand them, and mysteries aren't the same as things you don't get, right? So there's a slight, calculus 2 might be a mystery to many of you, but it's not a mystery in the same way God's a mystery. And so I think to say things that are inherently mysterious have to be known according to a proper method of knowing, which would be one that respects it as a mystery and doesn't try to force it into like a perfect, limited discrete account. And this is, I think, what Plato was worried about when people are defining the forms. They're trying to give a discrete account of the forms. And that's why most of the dialogues end in aporia, because he's trying to say, no, the proper way to know the forms isn't in this way of giving it a discrete account, but rather it's this other mode of knowledge. And he's trying to move you into this alternative mode of knowing. So yeah, I don't know. That was just, that was free of charge. So, but yeah, feel free to either push back or continue, or any other questions.
Just so I understand, with regards to the what you were just talking about, so we can't really fully know ourselves because we're made in the image of God, and we can't really fully understand God.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. It kind of depends on what you mean by no. So just as Plato's going to say, and we saw this in the like the symposium. Actually, the Louth article that we read on Plato was probably condensed a lot of this. That to properly know the form. So he thinks in some ways you can know the forms, but not in the way that you tend to think about knowledge. Knowledge of the forms is something that you don't really come to. It comes to you, and therefore it comes unexpected. It comes, what is it, like a thief in the night, maybe? it comes to you sort of on its own terms. Now you can prepare for it, and you can sort of like intellectually prepare for it, and he thinks you kind of have to do that. But there's always going to be something that kind of exceeds your intellectual comfort. You're not going to be fully satisfied, and that's because to be satisfied is to put things on your terms, on your sort of schema of things. And I think what he is trying to say, Plato, and I think also that you can apply this to persons, is that the subject matter is something that you can't put really on your terms. It's too broad. And so to know it properly is to kind of be unsatisfied by it. So to know yourself is to sort of realize that your life is kind of a mystery. Why in the world did I do this? Why am I doing this? Now, hopefully you have a better and better understanding, but to say that I'm ever going to be fully confident and satisfied, okay, now I know the meaning of my life and the point of my life and why I did this action, why I married this person, why I decided to do online education. This is all you from the outside. Yeah, it's right. You can say, okay, yeah, I'm starting to get an understanding, but I think it's always going to be somewhat mysterious. And the more you know, the more kind of mysterious it becomes to you. So I think that is kind of the way that you come to understand yourself. It's to understand yourself as opening up into this this really mysterious life that almost seems to be not in your control, but at the same time it is in your control because it's yours. It's your life, but you sort of realize it's almost being, I mean, the images, I think, in Clarke is that it's kind of being led, you're being led by something that is the good. So you're kind of not in control, but you're also in control of how you pursue the good. So it's this quasi-paradoxical thing. Did that kind of?
Yeah, that clears it up. It's insanely convoluted, but it clears it up.
Yeah, it clears it up as convoluted. There you go.
Does it kind of tie into Plotinus's view of like contemplation, of where like you can continuously contemplate, but you're only going to reach that perfect contemplation like a handful of times, probably?
Yeah, I think it does. It does relate to that, and I wonder. I don't know enough about Plotinus. I wonder if his understanding of contemplation actually comes to an end. So perfect contemplation is something that be completed, and that's because the one is one, and in some ways it is a completed reality. It's just sort of the perfect completed reality. Whereas I think on like a Christian metaphysics, like Clarke is proposing, a perfect contemplation of the one is actually a contemplation of the infinite Trinity as communal, and therefore to understand being is to understand its completeness in this eternal, I don't want to say ongoing because that makes it temporal, but it's this atemporal ongoing, which is never completed. And so I think Christian contemplation isn't exactly like a static, like, aha moment, like, now I see, I have this bird's eye view and I can see all reality, and then boom, there it is, I got it. It's rather this sort of, I mean, I don't know what it is to contemplate the Trinity. I'll let you know if that happens. But at least as described, it's as best described as possible. It's this sort of eternal, ever moving into. I mean, the Christian mystics described it as a darkness that was too bright to make sense of. It's sort of a light that blinds, and so you kind of are you're growing in focus of a reality. But the more you grow in focus of that reality, the more blind you become. It's sort of a really crazy thing to be describing. But it's not I get it all on Christian metaphysics, but it's a continual movement into. Yeah, jump in.
Yeah. Oops, turn off that sound. Okay. So I think what Dr. Jager's saying and what we've been talking about and what I think Clarke is talking about is we too often use knowledge in a univocal sense, that it always means the same thing.
Yeah.
And in the sense of especially in the modern West, the way that we use knowledge is sort of a fileable reality, right? We think of opening our folders and opening a file and opening the document, and there it is, and there it is in its completeness, right? So if you especially in online education, when you downloaded your Clarke, you had everything there, right? But it's not like, we have to stop thinking about knowledge in a fileable kind of way, and instead we have to recognize, when we talk about the mystery of being, knowledge is not fileable. And so we can't think even of the beatific vision as being this sort of, there it is, I see it in its completeness, now I'm just going to keep this file open all the time, and that's heaven. It's not that. It's knowledge instead becomes the discovery, right? It becomes this movement into the reality, and this receptivity and this communication that happens over and over and over and over again. Not over and over again, but like it is the giving and receiving itself rather than the thing that's given and received. And so knowledge in a mysterious way becomes a standing before the mystery in a gaze, rather than a sort of filing away within the internal hard drive of your mind, or whatever you want to say. It has to become this movement into. And so it's always going to be a movement of some kind. Even God is a movement of some kind, right? As Clarke actually points out when he says all being is act, all being is in motion. He put it in some homey way. I forget how he put it. But I think that if we don't understand being and act as being one, then we're always going to be looking for this completed static reality, which I think is maybe what Plotinus has in mind, which is not the Christian way of thinking about it.
And I want to add to that. So this is once again Life of Moses. Once again, Life of Moses. Something to do. I would read Life of Moses. On paragraph 243 of this. So this is by Saint Gregory of Nyssa, early Cappadocian father. He says, in another scriptural passage, the progress towards God, the progress to like the understanding of God. He says, the progress is a standing still, right? So he says, man is constantly on search for God because God's infinite. But he says, but yet at the same time, this search is itself a standing still. Because then he quotes scripture, you must stand on the rock. And the most marvelous thing of all, how the same thing is both a standing still and a moving. I mean, this idea of eternally moving towards God, but yet at the same time, that eternally moving towards God is itself an unchanging reality, I think is what allows for knowledge to now take on the form of love. So that it's not like knowledge as this completed reality and done, just as you don't want to think of love as this completed reality. Okay, now it's I told my wife I loved her. Why do I have to do it again? Right? And I actually made that joke with her once, and she didn't find it very funny. But I mean, it's not a it can be. So you think about love, it can be perfected out of one moment. But if you then take it to be, okay, therefore nothing needs to happen, that love can persist without you doing anything because we've accomplished it. I think you miss what love actually is. Oh, I gave bread to my neighbor, therefore I've done my friendly duty towards them. Rather, what it is to be a friend is to have that continually going on, that type of activity.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, bring bread to your neighbor tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a continual going on, and that's a sort of stability. The friendship is becoming more and more stable as this continually happens. And I think you can say the same thing about knowledge, that you know something better and better and better, and therefore the knowledge gets more and more stable. You're more confident and sort of certain in your knowledge of God, the more that you come to understand him. And I think that the knowledge, so there was this debate in medieval philosophy and theology about what was primary, what was like the real like state of salvation. Is it knowledge of God, or is it the willing of God, or the love of God? And I think what you can kind of see is that maybe that's a false dichotomy, that to know God and to love God are these two different things. Maybe it turns out that knowing is a type of loving and loving is a type of knowing. So stay tuned, folks. And I think when you think about the intellect and the will, these two faculties of man, and we tend to think of them as disjoint. They're focused on different realities. Intellect is focused on the true. The will is focused on the good. And now that's the case, but it turns out that the true and the good are actually one, right? There's one reality, which is the true, and it's the good. And these are in some ways distinct, but they're something can be true only if it's good, and something can be good only if it's true. So the object of love is also the same object as the object of knowledge. And I think to think knowledge can be this completed reality and therefore a static reality, it would be to say the same thing about the object of love or the action of love. It can be this completed reality. And I think that that's just false.
An observation, just that your definitions of love, knowledge, and being all sound like pretty much exactly the same thing. Just an observation.
They're called the transcendentals. Yeah, no, exactly.
And we only believe in one God, Nick.
There's only one God. And he's good, true, wise, powerful, beautiful. Yeah. No, that's no accident. One object, many ways of pursuing it. So the way of pursuing God via intellect and the way of pursuing God via will, they're kind of different ways in some sense, but they're all going to have a very similar characteristic because they have the same object. So they're going to have broadly the same contours. I don't know how to describe it really, but the same contours. Yeah. Any? I mean, so we're pushing about an hour now. I mean, this is fine with me. But any questions that are just lingering on the hearts of the people? This is your chance.
I have a question.
Yes.
So sorry, I came late, so if you already talked about this, I'll just listen to the recording later.
It's not on the test.
Okay. Okay, great. But my question, so there's this old man I talked to who grills me on philosophy and theology, and yesterday was one of those days. And so the thing that came up was, so you were talking about ideology, free, authentic belief. And so I was trying to explain like how your choice to follow a certain guideline is free choice. So it's not like you're stuck by those guidelines and they made the choice for you, but that you chose those to follow. And that, with Christianity, we don't just follow because a book tells us, but because of our love and our will and our intellect, if it aligns with those. But how do you know? And so I'm very confident in my belief that the Catholic faith is what I'm following, but how do you know that your intellect and will correspond with reality? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's hard. Yeah. I don't know the best way to answer it, but and that's to say that I don't know if my intellect and will are exactly corresponding to reality. I think there's a risk involved in being free and free volitionally and in some ways free intellectually. And to be free intellectually doesn't mean, oh, I get to believe whatever I want to. So now I have a hall pass to just believe whatever wacky stuff I want to believe. I don't think that's actually an intellectual freedom, because most of the stuff that you believe that you want to believe is still just a product of media and commercialism. But I think there's a risk involved, just as how do I know that this is the right person to marry, or how do I know if this is the right job to take, or if I should still be doing X, Y, and Z, or what have you. I mean, these are deep personal questions that people ask. How do you know it? And I think at the end of the day, a lot of these are issues of practical rationality. And the thing about practical rationality is that it's not a neat science, and so it requires prudence, because you're trying to correspond your life to the good, and that's a practical decision, and it might actually work out well, and it might not, and you're not exactly sure. You're trying to say, is this a good thing to do, to commit my entire life to this one person who I've known for maybe 2.5 years, 3 years, whatever? And that seems, so you're going to commit your entire life. You don't know what this person is going to do, a year from now, and you're committing your whole life to this. And there's a risk involved in that. And I think people don't like to make those decisions because of that risk. And they would rather someone say, no, here's what you can be completely confident, completely certain that this is the answer to what to do with your life. And I think people like that because it gives them a degree of, okay, now there's no mystery involved, and I don't need any faith in my spouse, or I don't need any faith in anything other than this one person's guarantee. Now, if it's your spouse saying, no, to death do us part, through sickness and health and yada yada yada, that person is making this assertion that I don't know what this is going to look like, but the commitment is going to stand, and so there's still a risk, because you look around and you see people not staying true to these vows. But I think there's no certainty about some of those practical issues. And that doesn't mean like, oh, it's all relative now, because certain things you do with your life are really going to mess your life up. Marrying certain people would probably really mess your life up, right? And I think the one way to think of it is kind of along those lines. Take it, the practical scenario, and then applying it to the theoretical thing. Okay, so here's what I think a person is, or here's what I think God is, and therefore salvation consists in what I should do with my life. I mean, there's a degree of faith that's required, and I think what we want to do is we want to say the gift of faith isn't strong enough. I need something else to rest on that's going to prove it to me. So you take what should be like properly within the domain of faith, and you say, no, I need something which is going to be a stronger foundation that's going to be able to prove it to other people, and even to prove it to myself, that I cannot screw this up, that I cannot be wrong. But I think if you have that, then you don't actually have faith. And I mean, it's a really hard thing to say that faith is not rational certainty, but yet it is more certain than rational certainty. I mean, it's a really crazy thing. What is St. Paul? How does St. Paul put it? Or people put it in many ways, but I think to recognize that my life would make no sense if what I believed about Christianity were false. And I have faith in Jesus Christ being both God and man, and I have faith in the Trinity, and I have these indications that, yeah, that seems to be, supportive of that. But someone could say, no, those don't actually guarantee or prove that Jesus Christ was God and man, or those don't actually prove that God is Trinitarian. And I think if these really are matters of like theological faith, then I don't think these are demonstrable realities. These are things that I believe ultimately out of a type of love that makes sense of things for me. So, I mean, it's kind of, the example that's sometimes used by Balthazar is, how do you know that your mother loves you? Can you prove that? And I think there's a degree in which you can't prove that your mother loves you versus she's just trying to hold the right attitude because she thinks, oh, this is going to be really good for this person's development. I don't really love this, miserable wretch, but I'm just going to act like it. I think there's no way you can prove it, but I think you would be, or at least I would be, let's just put it this way, I would be irrational to not believe that my mother loves me, but I can't prove it. And so I think some of these most fundamental truths of human existence are these things that we just know that we have a correspondence with reality, but we can't explain it because it's so basic, it's so fundamental. And anyone that's trying to demand a proof of it is trying to get you to approach a reality in a way that reality doesn't actually speak to you or correspond with you. So I think you could say, yeah, I know for a fact this is the case. And if someone says, well, prove it, I think you can say, I can't prove it. And that doesn't at all undermine my my certainty, but it's a different type of certainty. It's a much more foundational certainty. I don't know, does that make any sense at all? And so you can say no if you want to.
No, it makes sense. I just still, I guess, yeah, no, it does. I just am confused on can I? Yeah.
Okay. So there was this guy who became friends with a bunch of fishermen. Okay. Like 12 of them, I think. And he thought
Well, there was at least one tax collector.
yeah, there was a few tax collectors, but and these guys didn't know who this one guy was. They kind of had indications that he was someone special, but they didn't really know who he was. And he didn't really tell them who he was. And part of that, I think, was because if he told them, it wouldn't have made any sense to them. Does that make sense?
In fact, he did.
And he did try to tell them. That's right. Yeah.
And it didn't make any sense.
And it didn't make sense.
If I may quote that guy from the gospel today, I've just been thinking about this the whole time. And sorry, I really like the sound of my own voice. So for all of you who are listening, he says in the gospel today, if I do not perform my Father's works, do not believe me. But if I perform them, even if you do not believe me, believe the works, so that you may realize that I understand that the Father's in me and I am the Father. So that he's kind of saying, listen, like, to be fair, it is above your pay grade to know that I am the Father, to know that I am like the second person of the Trinity. But just look, like I made that guy see, like just believe, you know, that there is, even if I can't prove to you that I am like, you know, the I am.
Yeah.
You can at least see that, okay, there is something more here, that he's not just blaspheming like a normal person. He's doing some crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So
that doesn't guarantee that people will see, because there's a lot of Pharisees that saw Lazarus walk out of the grave, wraps and all, and they try to kill Lazarus. They try to kill the guy that was just raised from the dead, because they thought when people come to see Lazarus, they're going to think that Jesus is God, and we can't have that. So, I mean, they try to kill Jesus, but then they also try to kill Lazarus because of that fact, right? So I think what you have in the Pharisees is people who are so blind to the presence before them that nothing can really open their eyes. I mean, other than, say, God himself, and God himself basically says, you have to realize you're blind before you can see me. And so I think what you get in the Gospels is you get these people that had no certainty whatsoever. Well, they did have a certainty, sorry. They had no proof whatsoever that Jesus Christ was the Son of Man, the Son of the Father. They had no proof of that, but yet they still followed him. And it was because of their following him that they came to be more and more certain of this. And they couldn't explain it to someone else, right? They couldn't turn to the Pharisees and say, no, look, guys, you're reading the text the wrong way. You've got to read them this way. And I mean, Jesus basically did that in the temples. Some people had their eyes open. Some people tried to throw stones at him. And so I think what you have is this this very difficult reality for Christians to confront, which is you have to live the life of the apostles. And the life of the apostles was one which was following a guy who you're not entirely sure who he is. And you follow him not because you already know who he is, but because something about him corresponds to your desires, your understanding.
Like Giussani.
Yeah, I know. I'm like quoting Giussani, and I don't really read much Giussani, but
could it be? It's kind of like the gospel. Was it like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, where the blind man was cured, and they asked him kind of like, "What's going on? Like, how did you do this? How did this all happen?" And he goes, "I don't know. I don't know who this man is. All I know is that I was blind, and now I'm not." Like that.
Yeah.
I kind of think. It all.
Yeah, and then Jesus says, do you want to follow, or do you want to believe in the Son of Man or something? And he says, yes, who is he, so that I can follow him? And then Jesus says, something like he is the one, or you have seen him, or something. It was something like that. So this is like after he heals him, he says, it's the one you've seen that is the one that you're seeking to follow. So I think it's this whole idea of being able to have sight. And why do you have this sight? It's through, no hard works of your own. But yet once you start to see, things get a little clearer. But even in virtue of that, things get even more mysterious when you look at, like, okay, the apostles, they kind of knew who Jesus was until he decided to say, no, I got to go die, guys. They're like, no, you're like the Son of Man. You can't go die.
Yeah.
All right.
That's you don't understand.
Yeah. I don't know. Did that make any sense, Nicole?
No, it is making sense. I just now have more theology questions that this man was asking, but that is for a different conversation.
Okay. We should probably wrap this up. Anyone have any final questions or quick thoughts or points about Clarke, or anything?
I have a question I think that you could maybe respond quickly to. That's
Okay.
Or maybe not.
I have the power to kick you off of here.
All right, sweet. I'll just ask it quickly, and then hopefully you can answer it quickly. And it kind of corresponds. I'm not sure if you saw a comment I made on a video like a couple of days ago.
Maybe.
It kind of corresponds to that.
Yeah, I think I did. I'm not sure if you saw my response.
Yes, I did. It was awesome.
Okay.
But I just still have this question about, and I haven't read a lot of Aquinas, right? But what is Aquinas trying to say here? Because I think I have a good idea of what Clarke is trying to say here on page 52 and 53. And it's where Aquinas is addressing the importance of not just a passive obedience, but anyway, I was just hoping that you could address what Aquinas is saying here and what he is not saying here, because I think it can be really easy to misinterpret and then consequently hurt a lot of people. So I just, yeah.
Jeremy, do you want to
Comment on that?
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have
I mean, we did talk about this, right? In our
Can you guys hear Dr. Jankowicz? You might need to turn your speaker on. Okay.
I think it's better
Okay.
to use yours because otherwise it's a mess.
Okay.
But I think it is. I think we talked about this one of the podcasts, right? And we talked about how, and I think I was quoting his big runner quote somewhere along here, where he says, "There's just no way to get away from the fact that you yourself make a choice." I think it's kind of what Nicole was saying, right? When she said, "When I decide that I'm going to follow Christianity, I decide that I'm going to follow Christianity. It's not that Christianity imposes itself on me. It's that I make this decision to be the one that follows this," right? But that's not just sort of a one-time decision that you make and then you just go on, putzing around in your life and doing whatever you feel like. You always have to ask the question at every moment, how do I follow Christianity here, right? In these circumstances, in this concrete reality, in this mode of being that I'm encountering before me, right? And so it's the same that he says here, where he says, Clarke says it on 52 at the bottom, "I myself freely and responsibly judge whether it is here and now good for me to obey." And I think we made a comment in the video where we said, well, maybe it's a better way of putting it, what it means for me to obey here, right? Because I think you've already committed yourself to obedience, but the question of what obedience means in this situation is something that cannot be decided by a bishop and cannot be decided really even by the bishop if he's standing there with you, but has to be decided by you. And what obedience looks like in the concrete situation of your own life and the situation that you're encountering taking into account who you are and who the people that you're encountering are, has to be made by you. There's just no way to get around that. And because of that, then you when you decide what does it mean for me to obey this or that directive of a legitimate superior of mine, you cannot consult what I've referred to in class before as a pocket pope. Nobody has a pocket pope, right? And in fact, you can have a pocket pope. Even if you had a pocket pope, it wouldn't be like Jiminy Cricket cannot be Pinocchio's conscience. It just can't happen. Pinocchio has to make the decision himself, right?
Because he would need a conscience for whether or not to follow his conscience.
And Jiminy Cricket would need a conscience in order to tell Pinocchio what he thinks he should do.
Yeah.
So it would be a reductio ad absurdum, right? But ultimately, I think he's taking into account the seriousness of what a person is, what a person who is a free person is, right? Which I guess is just what a person is. But also the fact that the particular is truly unique, and that the particular, in all of the particular situations that they encounter, every situation is truly unique, and that therefore it has to be decided in freedom, in correspondence with this new communal reality of living in abiding with Christ.
Yeah.
That I have to make that decision for myself, and I can't pass the buck to anybody. Right. So I don't know if you comment on that.
No. I think I may have made reference in the podcast to Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless, which I sometimes use when I teach ethics. But you should read that essay. It's a really long essay, but the first 12 pages or so, really good. It's about freedom and ideology, and I think ultimately what you get is it's never possible to forego your own freedom for another, in the sense that it's never possible to have your decisions flow from something other than yourself. And so the way that Havel puts it is, people would say, oh, the communist system, they're the ones that's forcing me to do this. But he says, no, you're the one that's making your actions conform to the communist system. So you are the one that's giving sort of the power to totalitarianism, because you're the one that's freely deciding, yes, I will live according to your precepts.
Right.
And I think to be free is to realize I can decide to live according to precepts or not. Now, hopefully the ones that the popes and the bishops are putting out are good precepts. Hopefully these are good ones. And I think you can kind of recognize whether they're good or not in virtue of their correspondence to reality and their correspondence to the gospel and all that. But simply just because it's this guy saying it isn't what makes it true, right? And no pope should ever say, because I say it, it's therefore true.
Right.
It's because it corresponds to Jesus Christ or reality that it's true. And so you're not believing it on the authority of Pope so-and-so. You're really believing on the authority of Jesus Christ or truth itself or what have you. And that's exactly what I think the bishop or the Pope should want in the first place. I think that's ultimately what the sort of the grounding of the ex cathedra sort of doctrine is that it's not simply because I have the special authority to say everyone has to take showers on Tuesday. It's a new church law because I said so. It's because of what they say is through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, rooted in a truth more than just the words spoken by the bishop. It's rooted in a truth that is, lived in the person of Christ or what have you. So I don't know. Is that good for 50 cents? Okay, but we should really cut it. If you have questions, feel free to email or comment on any of the podcast videos. But we're going to move into the Schindler book, and we're just going to continue recording. So even though we're ahead of schedule on our recordings and posting of the podcast, you can just stay with schedule if you want, or if you want to go ahead, you can do that. What is time to a turkey, as they say. That's actually my saying, not anyone's. Okay. So with that said, enjoy your Friday, and we'll talk to you later.
Dr. Jager and Sienkiewicz, I have an interesting question. It should take like 30 seconds, but just
okay.
Other people don't have to. No. These other people, they can leave. It's just it's not even. It's to be fair, it's not even related.
Okay, so I'll just shut it down, and then I'll do something somehow.
Okay.
I don't know. Okay.
If you can.
Okay. See you later. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Actually, maybe